to today's video, and in today's video, I will be discussing each party's easiest path to a supermajority. And for those of you that don't know, supermajority is 60 seats where you essentially it's like a filibuster-proof majority. The other party can't filibuster, and as long as you have the House, you can pass any legislation that you want. So we are going to go get started now. While Republicans are statistically favored in the House, or excuse me, the Senate, um, I actually think that it'll be harder for them to get a super majority just because right now there are 35 seats that are to be counted, and both are going to be stretches. Obviously, they're both going to be very highly unlikely scenarios, but they are both scenario. The Republicans, because both parties will be getting seats that they likely won't come close to getting, but the Republicans are 35 or are excuse me 30 seats away. The Democrats are only 25 seats away, so it just makes it a little bit more difficult, even though they are statistically favored in the Senate. So I'll go start off with the Democrats. First off, they would have to they would have to get a seat in every state that Biden won in. So that'll actually be two flips in the states of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. I'm missing a seat somewhere, Illinois. So that gets them up to 52 seats. Now they're only 8 seats away. So first off, let's go give them North Carolina. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether or not North Carolina will go to them. I personally don't think it will, but it's definitely going to be one of the closer races. So let's give it to the Democrats. Let's also give them Ohio and Florida. Now both would be hard for them to be able to win in. Ohio, I think what it would take would be a Sherrod Brown-like candidate, someone similar to Tim Ryan. I think that Tim Ryan could do very well running against a candidate that is really disliked, somebody like Jim Jordan, even though he's not necessarily really disliked. Maybe someone further to the right than him. He's already said that he wouldn't run. Let's just assume for this that he does, and that Tim Ryan is able to do very well among white working class voters, which I think he'd be able to do very well among, and then do very well in the suburbs. That's what it would take. It's highly unlikely, but let's give it to him. And then the state of Florida. Let's just assume um, well, first off, Ivanka Trump primary is Marco Rubio, so he does not have that primary favor. Or Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz could also do it, and it would help the Democrats. But then let's assume that Val Demings or Stephanie Murphy runs. That would make it much more competitive, and let's assume that they do still well in like Pinellas County, Seminole County, Duval County, but they're also able to do much, much better in Miami-Dade and Palm Beach counties. It's highly unlikely, but let's give it to them as well. Now, they're only 5 seats away. Next up is the state of Alaska. Now, I don't think that they'll win Alaska. What this is essentially going off of is the idea that Lisa Murkowski switches parties and becomes a Democrat, or the idea that the Democratic candidate is strong enough to the point where they can get enough votes through the ranked choice voting system that they can do well enough. I think it's very unlikely. Let's assume that somehow the Democrats manage to pull it off through either of those two ways. Now they're only 4 seats away. Now, obviously, a lot of these are already stretches, but this is where it gets a little insane. First off, is the state of Indiana. Actually, let's package Indiana and Missouri together. In the state of Indiana and Missouri, both have previously had Democratic senators. For example, in Indiana, they had Joe Donnelly. He lost. Evan Bayh actually did very well in 2014. I think it was 2014, 2016. Yeah, I think Evan Bayh ran in 2016. I always get those elections mixed up. But I think that if we were to see, well, I guess potentially a primary opposition to Todd Young, then we could see something interesting happen, because if Todd Young were to get primaried, it could be very close if the GOP were to run a very far right wing candidate. We could see it getting very, very competitive. And I mean like a very, very far right wing candidate, like someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And the Democrats would have to run, or not even very competitive. The Democrats would have to run a strong candidate in this, like someone similar to Joe Donnelly, maybe even stronger, and then they would also just need to not necessarily have like a blue wave. I guess it would need to be a little bit of a blue wave. Joe Biden's approval rating would have to remain high. Obama did win there, and we may need to see a lot of Obama-esque campaigning, and maybe most likely an Obama endorsement. That's what it would take. It would be very difficult, but we could potentially see it happen. In the state of Missouri, Jason Kander would have to run. There's no doubt there, except for maybe someone similar to Kander, but it would most likely have to be Kander. And then they would have to obviously beat Roy Blunt, which could be very difficult. Let's assume that Kander managed to do it somehow. Let's say he does much better in St. Louis and Kansas City, or they grow exponentially over the next 2 years. It's highly unlikely, or that he's able to first label, and this is where it starts getting difficult. I'm gonna have to label Iowa and Kansas. Now, both of these are unlikely, but let me explain how both could happen. In the state of Iowa, Chuck Grassley would have to retire. He's been a senator in the state for a very long time, so he would have to retire. And the Democrats would have to run their attorney general. I forget his name, but he did very, very well. And the Republicans would have to run a far right wing candidate, and the attorney general, or they would have to run the candidates essentially just bad for all types of voters, especially bad among rural voters because they're obviously not going to do very well among urban voters, and I guess fairly bad among suburban voters. That's what it would take, and they would have to be somebody similar to Kander in Missouri. Kander in Missouri was, or I guess actually more similar to O'Rourke in Texas, where they make a not terribly competitive race very competitive. It would be very difficult, but I think the Democrats could maybe do it. I highly doubt it. Under these circumstances, I still kind of doubt it, but it could potentially happen. In the state of Kansas, this is more self-explanatory. Still unlikely, but it's more self-explanatory. Chris Kobach would have to primary Jerry Moran, and the Democrats would have to run Laura Kelly, the Democratic governor. It's still unlikely. Let's assume that she does well enough in Kansas City suburbs. She flips the county that Wichita's in, and does well in Wichita suburbs, and we could see also she would have to do among white rural voters. She does that, we could see it get competitive and potentially flip. Actually, well, if they were to run Chris Kobach and she were to run, it would definitely be very competitive, but it could be a very competitive race. So that's what it would take for the Democrats to get a supermajority. Now for the Republicans, I already said this would be more difficult. They would have to win every seat that they currently have, which is unlikely. I don't think they're going to win every seat that they have. I do think that they're going to come out with 50 seats still, because I think they're going to lose Pennsylvania but flip New Hampshire. But anyways, let's assume that they're also able. I'm just going to go label this blue because it's not up until 2026. Let's assume that they're able to do well in Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and New Hampshire. Now, Georgia, it's unlikely if they were to run Doug Collins and Raphael Warnock were to have some sort of serious problem, maybe have some sort of scandal. We could see it flip. I still am skeptical, but there's still always the possibility of Doug Collins being able to do well enough, or of the GOP taking a drastic turn and running a moderate with Trumpist appeal. It's kind of rare to find these days. Doug Collins is sort of a moderate Trumpist appeal, but he doesn't necessarily have the moderate appeal needed because he's a little bit too Trumpist, I guess. We could possibly see it happen in Arizona if the GOP were to run a moderate Republican. We could see it be a Republican state. We could see it maybe even being a lean Republican state if they were to run somebody like Doug Ducey, a moderate Republican. That's what it would take. Probably also Mark Kelly being disliked. A strong candidate for the suburbs from the GOP, an establishment McCain-Romney-esque candidate. It's unlikely the Arizona GOP is one of the worst GOPs in swing states right now, at least on this current electoral map. They're not very good. They're more or less incompetent. That's what it would take. They censored essentially their two biggest allies, Cindy McCain and Doug Ducey. They're not a good Republican Party, but let's assume that somehow they take a dramatic turn and somehow are able to win there. In the state of Nevada, I don't remember his name. Former governor. I'll actually go look him up. Excuse me, I forgot it. Or I actually don't know if I knew his name. I knew him, but I wasn't sure of his name. Brian Sandoval is I believe he won every state in every county. Excuse me. May have lost Clark County. But I think if they were to run him, it could be very close. I think that he could maybe, if he were to do well enough in Clark County and Washoe County, we could see it. I don't know. It could be very close. Let's just assume that somehow they're able to do it and they're able to win there. In the state of New Hampshire, it's actually pretty likely. Kristen Sununu running, he could flip the seat, so let's give New Hampshire to them. Now, there are a few more states, and we're already starting to see stretches. Colorado, Vermont, and Maryland. Now, Colorado, the GOP, not only would Michael Bennett have to do very poorly, he didn't do phenomenally in 2016, but that was also 2016. I think he did similar to Hillary Clinton in the state that shifted a lot to the left. If he were to be able to keep his, if people were to be able to, or I guess Republicans are able to keep his numbers similar to there, and then run a very strong candidate for urban areas such as Denver, and a candidate strong for a lot of Hispanic and Latino voters, we could see Colorado becoming very competitive. It's highly, highly unlikely, but let's give it to them. And then Maryland and Vermont, if Larry Hogan or Phil Scott were to run, I don't think that either of them will, and it's highly unlikely that even if they do run, it becomes that competitive. But let's assume that somehow they manage to do it. Patrick Leahy retires, and the Democrats run somebody like like the Attorney General T.J. Donovan or somebody other than Patrick Leahy. We could see it getting close if Phil Scott were to run. It's unlikely, but let's just give it to them. In Maryland, Larry Hogan. I don't even know who's running. I don't know if it's Ben Cardin or Chris Van Hollen, but if whoever it is, if they were to retire and Larry Hogan were to do well, or even if Larry Hogan were to just be able to get enough of the vote, we could see it. I don't necessarily know that it's incredibly likely, but let's assume that they somehow managed to pull it off. Now they're only 3 seats away. Now this is where it starts getting very unrealistic. First off, I'll get into California. Kevin Faulconer is the former governor of San Diego, I believe. I'll go fact check that. Former governor of San Diego, Kevin Faulconer. It's really popular. I actually got this idea from a commenter on a video suggesting this idea. So thank you so much for that. But he is I guess because he's the former mayor. Mayor of San Diego. He is a Republican. If he were to be able to do well enough, and if he were to advance somehow, and if he were to be able to run a strong enough campaign, especially if Alex Padilla doesn't advance in the general primary, and a awful Democrat does, a Democrat that's just an awful candidate, we could see it potentially happening. It's highly unlikely, but let's assume that he somehow manages to pull that off. And then that's actually the only one labeled. Next up, Hawaii. Now this is a stretch. It's more of a stretch than Lisa Murkowski becoming a Democrat, but it's a possibility. And that is, or not even a possibility. It's very unlikely, but that's the possibility that Tulsi Gabbard becomes a Republican. Now, I don't think it will happen because she's a progressive, but she has left, essentially, the Democratic Party. I believe she's a registered independent. She might not be, but she is, she's disliked by the Democratic Party. And she could leave the Democratic Party, maybe caucus with them, I highly doubt it, but maybe caucus with the Republicans. It's a stretch, I know, or we could see just a strong Republican candidate. We saw the Republicans do much better in Hawaii than previously, because a lot of Republican voters got mail-in ballots. If the Republicans would be able to do well enough, we could see it happen. It's highly, highly unlikely once again. I doubt it'll happen. But that's essentially what it would take. Or we could see, another thing that we could see is a Democrat running, a Republican running, and then Tulsi Gabbard running as an independent, taking so much of the vote away from the Democrats that a Republican is able to win there. That's how difficult it would be. It's highly unlikely, but let's assume that somehow they manage to do it. And finally, the state of Illinois. Now, Tammy Duckworth, who's defending her seat, won the seat in 2016, beating a Republican incumbent. Let's assume that the Republicans run a strong candidate that can somehow manage to do very, very well. They do well. They're a very strong urban candidate that can do well in Chicago. They're a moderate who can essentially get a lot of that vote from across the aisle. Someone like Representative Kinzinger, he would be a fairly strong candidate. I think he would still lose, probably by like likely margins. But let's assume that he's able to do well enough to reach across the aisle and do very well in Chicago. We could see it happen. That's how unlikely it is. But that is essentially what it would take. So yeah, those are my two maps. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for my next video, and I will see you all there. Bye!